Once upon a time, there lived an old white woman named Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson lived in a cozy apartment. She had lived there for many years, surrounded by pictures of her family and friends. The buildings were tall, and the streets bustled with people going to work, school, and stores. But even in a busy place, Mrs. Johnson often felt lonely. She loved to sit by her window and watch the world go by. The city was vibrant, with children playing in the parks and people chatting happily. But Mrs. Johnson missed the sound of laughter in her own home. Her children had grown up and moved away, and her friends had moved on. It was quiet, too quiet for her liking. One day, as Mrs. Johnson was enjoying her favorite cup of tea, she heard the pitter-patter of rain against her window. She watched as the raindrops raced down the glass, each drop a tiny adventure of its own. Suddenly, she heard a soft knock on her door. Curious, she put down her tea and shuffled to the door. As she opened it, she was greeted by two little girls standing on her doorstep. They were wearing bright yellow raincoats and had big, round eyes filled with wonder. "Hello," the girls chimed together. "We're Mia and Layla. Can we come in and play?" Mrs. Johnson looked at the twins, a warm feeling spreading in her heart. "Of course. Come in, my dears." She stepped aside, letting them enter her warm home. The girls squealed with delight as they dashed inside, shaking off the rain from their coats. The apartment was filled with the sweet smell of cookies baking in the oven. Mrs. Johnson had made her special chocolate chip cookies earlier that day. "Wow! It smells so good in here," Mia exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. Mrs. Johnson chuckled, "I just made some cookies. Would you like to help me finish baking them?" Layla nodded eagerly, "Yes, please." As they all gathered in the kitchen, Mrs. Johnson showed the twins how to mix the ingredients. The girls giggled and splattered flour everywhere, turning a simple baking session into a delightful mess. The laughter echoed in the kitchen, filling Mrs. Johnson's heart with joy. After they pulled the cookies out of the oven, the three of them sat on the floor with warm treats, sharing stories and dreams. Mrs. Johnson was enchanted by the girls' energy and imagination. They told her about their favorite toys, their games in the park, and the colorful drawings they created. But as the laughter continued, Mrs. Johnson noticed a flicker of sadness in their eyes, hidden beneath their smiles. With cookie crumbs still on their faces, Mia and Layla looked at Mrs. Johnson. "Can we tell you something?" Layla asked, her voice softening. "Of course, sweetheart," Mrs. Johnson replied, feeling a little twinge of worry. Mia spoke up, "Sometimes we feel scared at night. Our mom isn't always home. It gets lonely, and we don't know what to do." Mrs. Johnson's heart ached for the little girls. She wrapped her arms around them, pulling them close. "You can always come here if you feel scared. This is a safe place, and you are welcome anytime." The twins looked at her with wide eyes, relief washing over their faces. "Really?" they asked in unison. "Really," Mrs. Johnson assured them. "You are like my little sunshine. I love having you here." Mia and Layla beamed, feeling a sense of comfort that had been missing from their lives. That day marked the beginning of a beautiful friendship, one filled with laughter, warmth, and shared secrets. As the sun shone through the clouds, Mia and Layla visited Mrs. Johnson almost every day. Each time, they brought a piece of their world with them, stories, drawings, and giggles that filled the empty spaces in her heart. They sat together on her colorful rug, creating a world of their own. The girls shared their dreams of flying to faraway places, becoming superheroes, and having big birthday parties with lots of friends. Mrs. Johnson listened, her heart swelling with love for these two little souls. But during one of their playdates, the twins' laughter suddenly faded. They exchanged worried glances, and Mrs. Johnson could sense something was troubling them. "What's wrong, my sweet girls?" she asked gently. Mia took a deep breath. "Sometimes we worry about our mom. She doesn't come home like she used to, and we don't know where she is." Layla nodded, her eyes glistening. "We try to be brave, but it's hard when we're all alone." Mrs. Johnson's heart sank at their words. She hugged them tightly, feeling the weight of their fears pressing against her chest. "Oh, my darlings, it's okay to feel scared. You are very brave for telling me this. Can you tell me more about your mom? Where does she go? MIA and Layla exchanged glances again, their little hands intertwined. Sometimes she goes out, and we don't know when she'll come back. Other times, she just sleeps a lot, MIA explained softly. We try to make dinner and clean up, but sometimes we don't know how. Mrs. Johnson listened, her heart aching for the little girls. You're doing your best, and that's very important. But you don't have to do it alone. You can always come to me for help, okay? The twins nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. They knew they could count on Mrs. Johnson to be there for them. That afternoon, as they played and shared more stories, Mrs. Johnson began to realize how deeply the twins were affected by their home life. They were not just kids looking for fun, they were carrying burdens that no child should have to bear. Mrs. Johnson promised herself that she would do everything in her power to help MIA and Layla find safety and happiness. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of laughter and play. Mrs. Johnson felt like a child again, filled with joy as she spent time with the twins. They played dress-up, made colorful crafts, and even had a dance party in her living room. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Johnson decided to take the twins to the nearby park. It was a vibrant place, filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing on swings and slides. MIA and Layla's eyes lit up at the sight, and they ran ahead, their laughter ringing in the air. As they played, Mrs. Johnson watched the twins with a warm smile. They climbed trees, swung on swings, and made friends with other children in the park. It was beautiful to see them carefree, if only for a little while. After a while, they sat on a bench to catch their breath. Mrs. Johnson looked at them and asked, "What do you love most about the city?" MIA replied, "I love the park. It's so big and fun." Layla added, "And I love the ice cream truck. We don't get to go all the time, but it's so yummy." Mrs. Johnson smiled. "Ice cream is always a treat. What if we got some after we leave the park?" The twins cheered in delight, their worries temporarily forgotten. But as they laughed and played, Mrs. Johnson couldn't shake off the feeling that their happiness was fragile, like a bubble that could burst at any moment. Later, as they enjoyed their ice cream, the girl's demeanor shifted. Mia's smile faded as she looked down at her cone. "Mrs. Johnson, what if we can't have fun like this all the time?" "Why do you say that, dear?" Mrs. Johnson asked, concerned. Layla whispered, "Because we don't know if our mom will be okay. We miss her." Mrs. Johnson felt a knot form in her stomach. "I understand, sweetie. But you are never alone. I'm here for you, and we'll face whatever comes together." The twins smiled softly, grateful for Mrs. Johnson's comforting words. As the weeks passed, the bond between Mrs. Johnson and the twins grew stronger. They became a little family, supporting one another in ways that felt natural and warm. The girls would come to Mrs. Johnson's house after school, where they would share stories and help her with chores. Mrs. Johnson introduced the twins to her garden, a beautiful space filled with colorful flowers. She taught them how to plant seeds and water the plants. The twins were eager to help, their little hands digging into the soil as they planted marigolds and daisies. Every time they planted a seed, Mrs. Johnson would tell them, "Just like these flowers, you are growing strong and beautiful." The twins loved hearing her encouraging words, and they took them to heart. One evening, as they were sitting in the garden watching the sunset, MIA asked, "Mrs. Johnson, why do you like us so much?" Mrs. Johnson smiled gently. "Because you two bring joy into my life. You remind me of my own children when they were young, and I love having you here. You're like sunshine on a cloudy day." Layla looked at her thoughtfully. "You're like our sunshine too." Mrs. Johnson felt tears welling up in her eyes. It was a simple statement, but it meant the world to her. In that moment, she realized how intertwined their lives had become. The girls filled her days with laughter, and she filled their hearts with love and safety. One afternoon, as Mrs. Johnson was making a pot of soup, she heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find MIA and Layla looking worried. Their smiles were gone, replaced with frowns. "What's wrong, my dears?" Mrs. Johnson asked, kneeling down to their level. MIA looked down, playing with the hem of her shirt. It's our mom. She didn't come home last night, and we're scared. Layla nodded, her voice barely a whisper. We thought she might come back, but it's been a long time. Mrs. Johnson's heart sank. She gathered the girls in her arms, holding them close. Oh, sweet girls. It's okay to feel scared. But you are safe here with me. We can wait together. As they sat in the living room, Mrs. Johnson reassured them, telling them stories of bravery and strength. But inside, she felt a wave of fear for the twins. She knew they needed their mother, and the uncertainty of their situation weighed heavily on her heart. Days turned into weeks, and still, their mother didn't return. The twins continued to visit Mrs. Johnson, seeking comfort and love, but Mrs. Johnson could see the toll that the absence of their mother was taking on them. They seemed to grow quieter, their laughter becoming less frequent. One evening, as they sat together, MIA spoke up. Mrs. Johnson, what if she doesn't come back? What will happen to us? Mrs. Johnson felt her heart ache at the thought. We will figure it out together. You will always have a home here with me. But deep down, she knew that they needed more than just her love, they needed stability, and she had to find a way to help them. As the twins spent more time with Mrs. Johnson, she started to notice some alarming signs. They mentioned needing to cook their own meals and sometimes having to take care of each other when their mom was gone. Mrs. Johnson realized that they were far too young to be shouldering such responsibilities. One day, Mrs. Johnson overheard MIA and Layla talking softly while they were drawing pictures. I wish we could make pancakes, Layla said, her voice filled with longing. MIA replied, yeah, but I don't know how to do it without Mom. Mrs. Johnson's heart ached as she listened to their conversation. She knew she had to step in and help them in a bigger way. That evening, she decided to ask the girls more about their home life. Tell me about your evenings. What do you do when you get home from school? She inquired gently. MIA looked down and Layla fidgeted with her hands. Sometimes we watch TV, and sometimes we try to make dinner, MIA admitted, her voice trembling. But it's hard. We're just kids. Mrs. Johnson's heart broke at their words. You should never have to worry about cooking or being alone at home. You're just little girls. You need someone to take care of you. Layla nodded, tears filling her eyes. We try our best, but it's so scary sometimes. Mrs. Johnson wrapped her arms around them tightly. You are so brave, but you don't have to face this alone. I will help you find the support you need. We can talk to someone who can help your mom too. The twins looked up at her with hope in their eyes. With determination in her heart, Mrs. Johnson decided to take action. The next morning, she made a phone call to social services, explaining the situation. She learned about resources available for families in need and set a plan into motion to ensure that MIA and Layla had the support they deserved. Mrs. Johnson invited the twins over to her apartment again that afternoon. I have something important to talk to you both about, she said, her voice calm but serious. MIA and Layla looked at each other, worry etched on their faces. What is it? Layla asked, her small hands clasped tightly together. I spoke to someone who can help us, Mrs. Johnson began. They will be able to talk to your mom and see how we can all work together to make sure you are safe. Mia's eyes widened. Will they help her come back home? Mrs. Johnson nodded. They will try their best. It's important for your mom to get help, and for you two to be safe. The twins exchanged glances, a mixture of hope and uncertainty dancing in their eyes. They had always been scared of the unknown, but now they felt a flicker of hope for a brighter future. Can we still come to see you while they help our mom? Layla asked softly. Absolutely. You are always welcome here, Mrs. Johnson reassured them. This is your safe place. We will get through this together. As the girls hugged her tightly, Mrs. Johnson felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was determined to support MIA and Layla through this challenging time and to ensure they felt loved and safe, no matter what happened. The next few days were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Social services arranged a meeting with the twins' mother, and Mrs. Johnson made sure to be there to support MIA and Layla. On the day of the meeting, the girls were nervous but hopeful. As they walked to the community center where the meeting was held, Mrs. Johnson squeezed their hands reassuringly. "Remember, you are not alone. I'm here with you every step of the way." When they arrived, Mrs. Johnson noticed the butterflies in the twins' stomachs. They fidgeted and exchanged anxious glances. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to them. "Just be honest about how you feel." The meeting began, and the twins' mother entered the room looking tired and worn. Mrs. Johnson felt a pang of sympathy for her. She understood that everyone struggles sometimes. "MIA, Layla, it's so good to see you," their mother said, her voice shaky. "I've missed you so much." The twins stood quietly, unsure of how to respond. Mrs. Johnson encouraged them gently. "You can tell her how you feel. It's important for her to know." MIA stepped forward, her little voice trembling. "Mom, we're scared when you're not home. We don't know what to do." Layla chimed in, "We want you to come back and be with us." Tears filled their mother's eyes as she looked at her daughters. "I'm so sorry, girls. I didn't mean to worry you. I've been going through some tough times, but I'm trying to get better. I love you both more than anything." Mrs. Johnson watched as the twins' expression softened. They seemed to understand that their mother was struggling, too. They needed to work together to heal as a family. Over the next few weeks, the relationship between the twins and their mother began to mend. With Mrs. Johnson's support, their mother started attending counseling and joined a support group for parents. Slowly but surely, they began to communicate better, and the atmosphere in their home began to change. One sunny afternoon, as the twins and Mrs. Johnson were coloring pictures at the table, MIA suddenly stood up, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I have an idea. Let's make a special card for Mrs. Johnson to thank her for everything." Layla clapped her hands. "Yes. Let's do it." The girls gathered colored markers, glitter, and stickers, pouring their creativity into the card. They drew hearts, flowers, and even little rainbows. As they worked, they chatted about how much Mrs. Johnson meant to them. "Do you think she knows how much we love her?" MIA asked. Layla nodded. "We should tell her." After they finished the card, the twins carefully wrote a message. "You are our sunshine, Mrs. Johnson. Thank you for loving us." That evening, as Mrs. Johnson arrived home from grocery shopping, the twins rushed to her, excitedly holding out the card. "Surprise!" they shouted in unison. Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened with joy as she took the card from their little hands. She opened it, and her heart swelled with emotion. "Oh, my goodness! This is beautiful! You two are so talented!" She hugged them tightly, feeling tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. "You make my life so bright. Thank you for this wonderful gift." The twins beamed, their hearts warm with pride. They had created something special together, a testament to the bond they had formed. In that moment, Mrs. Johnson knew that their connection was strong, built on love and understanding. As days turned into weeks, the bonds within their little family deepened. Mrs. Johnson encouraged the twins to express their feelings openly, fostering an environment of trust and safety. But as they grew closer, the realities of their situation became more evident. One evening, while the three of them were snuggled up on the couch watching a movie, MIA suddenly turned serious. "Mrs. Johnson, what if our mom can't get better?" The room fell silent, and Mrs. Johnson's heart ached at the question. "I hope she can. She is trying really hard. But sometimes, people need a little more time to heal." "What if she goes away again?" Layla asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "That's a possibility, but no matter what happens, I will always be here for you. You are my family now, and we will face everything together." The twins looked at her, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They needed to feel reassured, but they also needed to confront their fears. Mrs. Johnson realized that this was an essential moment for them to understand that love can withstand challenges. "Let's make a promise," Mrs. Johnson suggested. "No matter what happens, we will always talk about our feelings and support each other." "Okay?" The twins nodded, their small hands clasped together. "Okay," they whispered in unison. Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of hope as they hugged tightly, knowing that they would navigate this journey as a family. Mrs. Johnson knew that to truly support Mia and Layla, they needed more than just her love, they needed a network of support. She reached out to local community organizations that offered assistance to families in need. One day, she organized a meeting at her apartment with a social worker named Mr. Adams. He was kind and patient, ready to listen to the twins' needs and help them find the right resources. When Mr. Adams arrived, the twins were nervous but curious. They had seen him before during their mother's sessions but hadn't interacted with him much. Mrs. Johnson introduced him warmly. "This is Mr. Adams. He's here to help us figure out how to make sure you both feel safe and happy." Mr. Adams smiled reassuringly. "Hello, Mia and Layla. I'm so glad to meet you. I've heard wonderful things about you from Mrs. Johnson." As they all sat together at the table, Mr. Adams asked the twins questions about their feelings, their home life, and what they wanted for their future. With Mrs. Johnson beside them, the girls opened up about their fears and dreams. Mia said, "I want to feel safe at home. I want to be happy." Layla added, "And I want my mom to come back and be okay."